guys, welcome to Bridging the Realm. Today, my guest is Marilyn Mendoza. Marilyn is a psychologist in private practice in New Orleans, Louisiana for the past 34 years. She is also a clinical instructor at the Tulane Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry, and she currently writes a monthly blog on grief for Psychologists Today. Marilyn is the author of a book called We Do Not Die Alone, Jesus is Coming to Get Me in a White Pickup Truck, and she's also been researching the topic of after-death communication, deathbed visions, and shared death experiences. In her free time, Marilyn volunteers in the Visiting Pet program and at an inpatient hospice facility. So Marilyn, thank you so much for being with me today. I'm so glad to. This is quite the topic that you've done, in your practice, and I'm just really fascinated by the whole idea of death after death communication, deathbed visions. It's really, I guess, it's a topic that not everyone is really quite open to, because a lot of people have a very preconceived idea of what happens after death, and the whole idea of whether there is something after death or not. So what led you to get into this topic? And you've been doing this for quite a while, so how did you get into this?
Well, I had an interest in the area for a long time, but it was when my mother was dying that things really kind of coalesced for me. We had her here in the house for a while with hospice, and during that time, I guess there was one Sunday when we didn't have caretakers here, or nobody was in the house but my mother and myself. And so I was straightening up her room, and she called me to her bedside. And I said, "What do you need, Mom?" And she said, "I'm ready to go." So I said, "Okay, if that's what you want to do, then," I held her and kissed her, and I said, "It's okay, you can go." And she got very quiet. And then she got very angry within just a couple of minutes. And I said, "What's going on?" She said, "They told me I can't go, that it's not my number." And I just cracked up laughing, because I didn't know you had to have a number to to die. But she was very angry, and obviously it wasn't her time. So there was one other time so she was receiving communication, the deathbed visions is what she was experiencing. And then she had another one where she was ready to go. And my father's mother, who had lived with us, was blocking the door, and she couldn't go through the door. So also at the time, I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew it wasn't necessarily good. But I understand that even on the deathbed, people can work through issues and grow. And people don't normally think about that you can grow as you're dying, and what you take into the next life, if you believe that. Yeah. So after she died, I became very interested in exploring more about what those things were, because they were amazing experiences. And so I began doing research, reading, and I guess I also was writing my book at that time too. So I had done some of that, but it was basically with my mother dying that I became more interested in it. After she died, and this is after death communications, I guess we'll talk more about, is that I started finding little white feathers everywhere. And in my office, which there was no way a little white feather could get into my office, given the building I was in. And just kind of every place I went, I found these little white feathers. And I immediately believed that it was my mother communicating with me. Wow. She was around. And then after about a year, I didn't see them as frequently. And after I had written my book, I was going on a tour. And I went to do a radio show in another state. We got there a little bit early, so we went to eat lunch, walked out, and I was going to the restroom, which was outside of the building, and I was walking on the pavement, and there wasn't one thing on the pavement except a little white feather right in the middle of the pavement. I mean, I scooped that thing up because I was anxious. That was my first radio interview. And, but I knew she was with me, and I held on to that feather. And it meant a lot to me. It gave me a lot of peace. So that's really kind of how I got into all of this. And then it's just kind of expanded after that.
Oh, wow. That's really fascinating. I guess that's probably the most profound ways in which it can happen when it has an actual, it's related to your personal story, because that's, I guess, what drives you to really research this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, back when I was interested in this and got started in it, it wasn't so okay to talk about it,
Yeah.
and it's gotten a whole lot better now.
Yeah.
But there were a few people that you could share it with.
Yeah.
Of course, I did with my friends and family, but I became interested in doing my readings about, most of the experiences that people had were good experiences prior to dying, but some people didn't have such good experiences. They were very frightening. So I got interested in the topic of people saying, if you're good, you go to heaven, and if you're bad, you go to hell. Well, I thought I would try to explore that, just to see what happened. And to me, the best way to look at that was to go to a prison. So there's a prison here in Louisiana called Angola, which is one of the worst prisons in the country. People go there who are never coming out again. Some of whom they're murderers, rapists, just the worst felons that are there. But in that situation, they have opened a hospice for the dying patients, which I thought was just fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah.
And the inmates there are the caregivers for the ones who are dying. And it's just a fascinating program anyway, but I thought, what better place to look at deathbed visions, and if somebody's going to go to hell, perhaps it's somebody who's murdered somebody.
Yeah.
So, and the volunteers there, the caregivers are screened, they're trained, they're interviewed by staff as well as other caregivers. So it's people who really are very caring in working with these men. And so I interviewed them about deathbed visions that they had experienced with their patients. And not one of them, maybe just one, had a distressing experience. The rest of them, their family came to get them from the other side to help escort them home. There was one gentleman who said that his family was coming to get him in a Cadillac. And of course, in my book, there was an account from a nurse that a patient was dying and saw his mother coming to get him in a white pickup truck.
Yeah.
And she was driving the truck.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that was the funniest story I'd ever heard.
Yeah.
So just the image of that. So that's why I made that the subtitle of my book. But I just thought it was interesting that, what people believe about what happens when we die may not be exactly what happens. So, and I've really worked with a lot of people, and I've not had the experience of people talking about really scary, frightening deathbed visions. Most of them are very comforting, for not only for the people who are dying, but for the family and the caregivers that are there too.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so fascinating. And it definitely makes you think, okay, this preconceived idea that, bad people go to hell, good people go to heaven, it really puts things into perspective when you look at the actual research. Yeah. So with the people who had negative experiences, as we'll call them, was there a common denominator? Maybe were they like, particularly religious, or they had I don't know, was there something common between them that made them
It doesn't seem to be. The research that's been done on that tends to suggest, well, there was one researcher who seemed to feel that every either near-death experience or deathbed vision would start off negative, but then end positively. And this is more for near-death experience.
Yeah.
But, people don't talk about the disturbing experiences much anymore. There was a time about maybe 20 years ago when they did. And the focus was on, who had them, who didn't have them.
Yeah.
And it was, then finally people decided, well, you can't really answer that question because anybody could potentially have it.
Yeah.
So the focus shifted to the after effects of the near-death experience,
Okay.
and how it changed people's lives, even if they had a disturbing experience and came back to talk about it, that it still had a powerful impact on their lives. So it's just a fascinating field for me.
It is, yeah, certainly. And it's strange because there's not too much research into that, specifically of after-death communication as well. And why do you think that is? Is it mainly because, people don't believe in it as much, and it's quite
Well, I think with after-death communication, the Bible really is Guggenheim and Guggenheim's book, Hello from Heaven.
Yeah.
And that's an older book, but it's still like the classic in the field. And other people have written them, and I've written some stuff in my book about that. And people talk about it more. I work with a lot of, my specialty is grief, and people who've lost loved ones, and particularly children. And these after-death communications are so important to them, and help them just get through such a horrible time. It's really amazing.
Yeah.
I see a big difference in those people who accept that form of communication as opposed to parents who don't. It's much harder.
Yeah. Do you see like a general improvement in their lives for the people who do believe in them? Yeah.
Yeah. It makes, they still grieve terribly, but it makes the grief perhaps less intense. Although that's not really a good way to describe it. It makes it bearable.
Bearable. Yeah.
Bearable.
Exactly. Yeah. I can totally relate to that. Yeah. I had my mom passed away as well, so a few years ago. So before that, I didn't know anything about the after-death communication. I wasn't open much to spirituality and stuff. And of course, when it did happen, I was kind of forced into it because it was just unbearable. And just like you said, after I began to realize how much more there is out there that we don't know about. And I started to get a lot of these signs, actually, that we're going to talk about a little bit more from some of your articles. But I started to get a lot of those signs as well. I got feathers. I could feel her presence, all of these things. And of course, I went to see a medium who could actually communicate with spirits of those who have passed away. And that for me made such a huge difference. I mean, it made all the difference to me because it made it so much bearable and so much easier for me to actually get on with my life.
Absolutely. Knowing that they're still there and a part of you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
and with the,
let
me just say one thing.
Yeah.
With the after-death communications that I'm talking about, they're not from a medium or psychic. These are things that people are noticing themselves. So, I mean, a lot of people do that. They go to talk to someone, but for the most part, what I'm talking about is what people become aware of, like the feathers or things like that.
So it's very much proof based on their own experiences. Yeah. So that's totally. Yeah.
And what's interesting in therapy is I bring it up because most people don't want to bring it up and talk about it because they're afraid that somebody's going to think that they're crazy if they say that, or dismiss it and just, but I don't do that.
Yeah. Well, tell me a bit about that, because I've noticed as well, and also in myself, I noticed, I never wanted to really speak to anyone about it because I did think at one point I was crazy, it's kind of like, oh, I probably shouldn't mention. How often do you see that in people, that they think?
A lot. Yeah. I mean, there's still such a stigma to these things. And it's unfortunate. But again, when I'm talking with people who are friends or people that I work with, patients, I mean, I don't hesitate now to share all these things. When I first got started, I just knew for sure they were coming for my license, my doctorate license, because of the things that I was doing and investigating, but nothing bad happened. Yeah. And over the years, it's become more open and people are talking about it, and just doesn't have the stigma that it used to have.
Yeah, which is so good.
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah. Talking more about death in general.
Yes, definitely. So when you first started doing it, well, first of all, did you have did you think, you know, you were maybe hallucinating or imagining things? Did you straight away know that this was coming from your mom?
Yeah.
You
Yep.
did.
Yep. I
Okay,
did.
so you were quite familiar with this sort of
Yeah.
spiritual side of it. Okay,
Yeah.
were
I had
you?
already been involved in all that because I had an interest prior to her dying. So it just kind of consolidated things for
Yeah.
me.
Okay. Also, that definitely helped that you were quite
Oh,
open to it.
oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So when you started to do your research for your book, and you know you started approaching nurses and people, how did they react to you?
Well, I had an audience that was used to it also because these were nurses who worked in hospice or
Um,
in oncology, so
mm,
that they were around people who were dying, so that these things weren't strange to them, you know,
mm,
because they saw it all the time.
yeah.
So, you know, my sample was one that, you know, they knew what it was about.
Yeah. Yeah. They knew what it was
Yeah,
about. Okay.
yeah, and they were anxious to take the questionnaire, and you know, anxious to find out what the results were of it.
Mm. Mm. Wow. So, what are some of the most memorable stories that you really kind of stuck with you from doing all the research for the book?
Oh my! Well, the most memorable has to be the one where the gentleman saw his mother coming with Jesus in a white
Pickup.
pickup truck.
That's
That,
quite a
that
fascinating.
definitely is. Um, oh my goodness! Let me see. There were so many of them. I think one of them was a woman who was moving out of her home. It had been her family home, and then when she got married and her
Mm,
parents had died, she lived there.
mm,
And so her father had died, and so as she was standing there in the house by herself,
mm,
she asked her father if he was there to give her a sign.
mm.
And all the lights went off in that house, and
Wow.
no other lights went off on her block. And so
Wow.
it's things like that.
Mm,
There was another one where a woman's husband had been a big football fan and had a lot of memorabilia on the shelves, and he had died. And so she was looking at the shelf and trying to decide whether she should take those things down.
mm,
And all of a sudden, one of the figures just fell over. It fell down, and where it had never moved for like 25 years before that.
mm.
So she got her message that she was
Oh,
not to take those down.
yeah.
So things like that. Or I also had, and this is a pretty definite sign. One of the men I was working with, whose wife had died, was looking to get her chili recipe because he didn't really know how to cook. So he was looking for a chili recipe. He was looking all over, and he opened up a cabinet, and a book fell on his head. And it was the book that had the recipe for the chili in it.
Wow.
So that was hysterical. It hit him
That,
in the head.
yeah, I
So
mean,
it's things like that, you know.
wow. Well, if that's not a sign, then I don't know what is.
Yeah,
Out of all
yeah,
the books, yeah.
yeah. He enjoyed that.
Wow, that's really, oh, that's so, it's so nice, I guess, just for, you know, people to just to know that their loved ones are still around them and they, you know, are with them in the important moments and just to
Mhm.
have that sort of comfort.
I've, yeah, I've had experiences when patients have died, and I've been in my office and I've felt their presence
Oh,
in the
wow.
office, and shortly after they died, and that was just spectacular.
Wow. Oh, it's almost like they're coming to say goodbye.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, what about the? I'm interested to know how the nurses, you know, were reacting. I mean, it seems like they were already quite open to these things, and you know,
Mhm. Yeah.
witnessing these things that people were
Mhm.
experiencing. Do you think, in a way, they were? Did that make them see life in a different way? Did it change their mind about what reality is and after death?
I don't know that it did. I think that there were a few nurses. One of the things I asked them was, do they consider this a spiritual experience or something else?
Mm,
And the vast majority of them felt that these were spiritual experiences, but
mm,
some of them didn't, which is hard to believe that some of these nurses who witnessed all this, but they didn't think it was a spiritual experience. I guess they thought that it was just the dying brain.
mm,
Um,
mm,
but for the most part, yeah, the nurses.
mm.
I mean, you talk to any hospice nurse, and they'll just nod their head. Oh yeah, I've seen that. I know this.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, wow.
Mhm.
So, what were some of the, I know you described in your book that there were about 57% of these, of the people who saw deceased
That's right.
relatives. Is that,
Hmm.
yeah?
Relatives. Hmm.
Yeah. So,
Meaning, a mother, father, sister, brother, whatever. That's the most frequent
yeah,
figure that appears to take people over to the other side.
yeah.
Deathbed visions, and
Mm,
also in near-death experiences, people meet their deceased relatives, and
mm,
it brings them a lot of peace and comfort and joy to see somebody who, like you've been married to for 25 years or something, and here they come back to get you. Or see your mother. The mother is the most frequent appearing figure in these,
mm,
so that mother's work is never done, so she has to come
yeah,
back from the
yeah.
dead to take her children
Yeah.
home.
Oh, wow.
So yeah.
Wow. What are some of the other experiences that people have had that nurses have described of people having? Mm.
Well,
You
you
mentioned
mean the
angels.
deathbed visions?
Yeah.
Or just in general, there are what people experience are uh, deceased relatives, spiritual figures. It can be angels, it can be Jesus, it can be whomever.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, and they also talk about seeing beautiful scenery,
Yeah.
uh, things that you would never see on Earth. The colors are so gorgeous.
Yeah.
Thomas Edison, as he was dying, said, "Oh, it's very beautiful over here."
Wow.
And Steve Jobs, of course, when he was dying, said, "Oh wow, oh wow." Like, wouldn't you love to know what he saw?
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that people do experience. They also might hear music, harp music,
Wow.
or angels singing, or they'll hear angel wings. Sometimes it's not so much what they hear, but maybe what they see. You'll find people looking up in the corners of rooms, and this happens a lot. And
Mm.
that's usually where somebody is, whether it's a
Mm.
relative or a spiritual figure.
Yeah.
And the theme is always that they've come to take them home. They're
Mm.
there to help them make that transition and to take them home.
Yeah.
And so people who've been agitated once they've had these experiences aren't agitated anymore. They're
Wow.
able to die peacefully. And the nurses will say they much rather have somebody come from the other side to take them home than have a living relative in the room,
Really.
because it makes for a more peaceful passing.
Mm.
And the other thing I want to say, because I just had somebody at hospice, that a family member that I shared this with, is that we're always waiting for, when are they going to die? The doctor said it might be any time, or it could be a couple of weeks. And they worry that if they leave the bedside, they're not going to be there when the person dies.
Yeah.
And what I've found is that people die in their own time. Is between them and God.
Mm.
I had a woman that I was treating, it was a while back, that her mother had died and she wasn't able to be there with her.
Mm.
And she felt very guilty about that. So when her father was dying, she moved him into her house,
Mm.
and somebody was with him 24 hours a day, and it was primarily her.
Yeah.
One day she was there alone with him and waiting for a package that was supposed to come. And the doorbell rang and it came. She figured that was it. And she thought, well, I can just run. It'll take me 2 minutes. I'll go out there and I'll get the package. I'll come back. So you know how this story ends.
Mm.
Waited till she left the room and he died. And she
Wow.
came back. So that's such a profound thing. It's like, and sometimes people want to die alone.
Alone. Yeah.
They don't want the family to see it, or whatever it is. But,
Mm.
feeling guilty about that um, is just almost a wasted emotion,
Yeah.
because that's you can't predict that, and you can't always be there. It's nice if you
Mm.
could, but a lot of people suffer extreme guilt from that.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I've heard that quite a few people have said that as well, that a lot of people prefer to die alone, and
Mm-hmm.
and so many there's been so many stories that I've heard that, you know, the family of the family will be around the person who's dying, and the minute they have to leave the room, it's like boom, they're gone.
That's right.
Like they just need that space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the person I was talking to at hospice, it was his father who was dying, and he had to get back to another state, and he couldn't stay any longer. And so after we talked, he said, well, I feel a lot better about it. So he was able to do what he had to do.
Yeah.
After he said what he had needed to say to his father. So
yeah, I guess the most important thing is that the people who are still living do express whatever they want to express to the person, and then that's really it. Yeah.
'Cause I always tell them, you know, hearing is the last to go, so you can say whatever you need to say.
Oh, okay. Oh wow, hearing is the last to go.
Last
Yeah,
to go.
definitely. Yeah, and also when you mentioned about people staring at corners in the room, that reminded me of this other story. I was speaking to a soul midwife actually, and her mom, when her mom was dying, she said that she was looking in the corner of the room and saying, "What's Archangel Michael doing in the corner of the room?" You know, and then
That's great.
She wasn't very spiritual, so she didn't believe, you know, in things like that. And she was like, "Oh, that's nonsense. They don't exist, you know." But she could still see him.
Funny. That's great.
So,
Well, yeah, there's stories in the book and also other places I've heard where Jesus is in the corner of the room. And there was one account where the nurse had said, "Who are you looking at?" or "What are you looking at?" And the man said, "Jesus is in the corner of the room." And so she said, is he saying anything to you? And he said, "No." "Well, why don't you talk to him and ask him, you know, why he's here, whatever." And he told the nurse that Jesus said that he was going to help him cross over, and that was why he was there.
wow.
So, you know, that impacted the nurse too.
Yeah.
The people, when you work with the dying, these things are just so comforting. And you know, you see people suffering and know that they're not going to be suffering because if somebody's going to help them.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And how has your opinion changed from when you first started doing the research to now, in terms of, you know, have you had any realizations about life and what life is about? Because I say to everyone, you know, I've been doing research into this kind of topic for a while now. And for me, the most profound thing was not how much it taught me about death, but how much it taught me about life and living, and, you know, what's really important in life. So, you know, most people tend to kind of not want to talk about death because, of course, no one really wants
absolutely
to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how much it can teach you about living and, you know, what's really important. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, you know, I think it puts things in perspective. It also, these experiences tend to take away the fear of death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's such a big thing because that's what everybody's afraid of.
Yeah.
You know, now we have death cafes, and those started over in England, I think. And other things where people are talking more about it, but still everybody is very much afraid of dying.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that all these experiences could help people not have that fear, you know, because they're just amazing. And it's not that it's in somebody's mind that they made it up or whatever. There's so many examples of it that you can't dismiss it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the after-death communication, sort of the key categories, and that it's split into, and what people tend to experience after a loved one has passed, and how they experience the communication with them. So in one of your articles that you've written in Psychology Today, you wrote about the after-death communication and the 12 main categories that were identified by Guggenheim. Yeah. So tell me a bit about those. So I'm just going to read them out quickly. So anyone who's listening, maybe they'll be able to see what they've experienced. So the first one is sensing a presence, then hearing a voice, feeling touch, smelling a fragrance, visual experiences such as appearances of their loved one, visions of the deceased, twilight experiences, which are altered states when you see them in sleeping states or anything like that. Then after-death communication while asleep, out-of-body communication, physical phenomena, telephone calls, and symbolic after-death communications such as signs, such as feathers and stuff like that. So tell me a bit about these, and are these sort of the most common things that you've, in your research, you found people tend to experience?
Yeah. Oh, I think the most common tend to be seeing deceased relatives, and the finding of symbols, whether it's a butterfly or a flower, or, you know, I think that those tend to be the most common. Also coins, people finding coins. I worked with one woman whose son had died, and she kept finding these pennies. And the pennies were, not only were assigned, but the date on the penny was relevant to dates in the child's life, which was really very interesting. So yeah, I think some of the, and dreams are very common that people have, where a loved one will come to them and give them a message, or my mom came and told in a phone call in a dream that she was okay. Did you hear from your mom in a phone call or anything?
No, I've never had a phone call. No, I had dreams, and I had, I definitely felt her presence quite a lot. And I had the sort of, when I'm half asleep, you know, in that sleep, in between sleep state, and I felt like I could very much see her and feel her, but I never had a phone call. No, so that's that's an interesting one. Yeah.
Well, it is, and not only, you know, it was a phone call and a dream, but I've had patients who've experienced real phone calls where a woman's son had died, and her phone would ring, and his picture would come on the phone.
Oh wow!
But his phone was, you know, not there anymore.
No news.
And so she had other experiences like that, where she had been with a friend, and the friend had like a pink phone. This was like around Valentine's Day, and she thought to herself, you know, I'd like to have a pink phone like that. But she never said anything to anybody. And she, one day there was a package that came, she opened it up, and there was a pink phone. And so she didn't know who had sent it or whatever. And when she checked on it, it was from her son's account.
Oh, wow. That's something.
Yeah, but particularly she said she hadn't told anybody, including the woman whose phone it was. So, you know, there are all kinds of things that can happen. So, but I think, you know, like I said, the dreams, and sometimes when we see figures at night, they tend to come to at the end of the bed, at the foot of the bed.
Yeah.
Not sure why that is, but that's the case. They'll stand at the foot of the bed.
That is.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. And sensing a presence is a big one also. So I think that those are having some of the out-of-body experiences where you go and you visit the person who's died in their new surroundings is not very common. I've had, I think, just one person experience that, but you know, that was a very powerful experience.
Oh wow!
I think there, those who have died are still available to us.
Yeah,
you know, and I believe they watch over us and are there with us.
So in your practice, because you're also mainly a grief counselor at the moment, what would you say is, for anyone who might be going through grief right now who's listening, what would you say is the main thing that they can take away from this and to remember when they're going through grief?
Well, I think to pay attention to what's going on around them. I think a lot of people get upset because they haven't had these after death communications. And if you're not paying attention, you know, you may be missing something. I think also reading, either getting my book or Guggenheim's book, Hello from Heaven. And there are other books out there too that have written about it, but so that you can become more aware, and you might even find that something's been happening that you didn't connect. I think another thing that's come up is orbs, where these are little orbs of light. And again, I worked with somebody whose son had died. I see a lot of parents whose children have died. And she just began seeing these white things in the pictures. And then she started thinking, I wonder if that's him. And she's showed me videos that she's taken where she's just been in a dark room and called to him. And then here you see the orb come flashing by and like this. And it was,
Wow.
it's amazing. It's
That's
amazing.
amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so that really helped her an awful lot.
Wow, that's really incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just for one, the positive effect it will have on the person, that's incredible in itself. But also just being able to see it visually, because I think most people like to see things visually. We're very much, you know, proof based, and we want to see things for ourselves. Yeah. Wow, that's really amazing. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So there's some just absolutely amazing things, and people can't understand it or don't see it as something spiritual, so they just dismiss it.
Yeah.
Or think there's something wrong with you. That's
yeah.
that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I think that tends to be the most common thing, where people either think they're imagining things and then go crazy, or they just don't even notice it because we're so much in our heads. We're not allowing to open up to anything that's actually happening. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So where do you see this going with your research, and now with people becoming more open to this? What's your vision about the future? You know, people believing in a kind of life after death, and believing that our loved ones continue to exist. How do you see this? Do you see this improving and getting more, you know, well known?
Yeah, I think it is, because there are many more people in the field now who are giving talks, podcasts, having conferences, the whole gamut. And it's much more accepted now. I mean, I've just, like I said, I've seen a big change in the time that I've been working with it. And so I see it only increasing. There's something newer that's out. It's called the shared death experience. Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote the book Life After Life, introducing near-death experience, has written a book called Glimpses of Eternity. And a shared death experience is basically somebody having a near-death experience, taking somebody else along with them. So what that means is you can be by the bedside, you can be a caregiver of somebody who's dying, and they start to die, and the caregiver gets caught up in the initial stages of that, so that they may also have an out-of-body experience, travel through a tunnel, see a light, and be part of a life review. But then they come back, and both of them come back, or I'm sorry, either the caregiver comes back, or they both come back, or the caregiver comes back, and the other person dies. But he's experienced that with the dying. There's also a remote shared death experience. I was just talking with someone just last week, and she said that her grandfather was dying, and they were some distance apart, but she knew he was dying, that she was sound asleep, and she had a dream that he came and kissed her on the forehead. And she woke up in the morning and found out he had died during the night. So that's a remote shared death experience. He came to see her. So more and more things like that are coming out. And I'm gathering from what I've been involved with that the shared death experience is being treated now like the near-death experience was when it was first acknowledged and came out. There's a lot of skepticism about it. And the thing that's so interesting about the shared death experience is that the person who's experiencing with the dying is not ill or dying themselves. So that pretty much shoots the brain chemistry idea about why this is happening. So obviously a lot more research needs to be done, but that's something that's developing now that will grow, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, because I guess you still have that one person to come back and to report what they saw.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So even more of a proof. Yeah.
But people are having a hard time accepting that.
Yeah.
But it will, just like the near-death experience when it came out. I mean, I remember the first time that I saw something on television about it and talked about an out-of-body experience, and they were showing what that would look like. And I
Mm.
remember turning to my husband saying, "Is that possible?" And
Mm.
so, and then ever since then, I've been involved in learning more about it. But
Mm.
again, I think the shared death experience, people are having the same reluctance to accept that as they did the
Mm.
other. So I think at some point they will
Yeah,
come
definitely
to
with
it.
time. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to ask, why do you think our Western society is just finds it so difficult to generally accept the idea of that the spirit, or that we do even have a spirit, and that, you know, our consciousness continues to exist outside of the brain, and that there is an afterlife, and that we can communicate? Because for example, the Buddhist tradition, they very much believe in the afterlife, and, you know,
Mm-hmm.
they do all of these rituals to guide the dying into the afterlife,
Yes.
to help them, you know, find their way. Why do you think the Western society is so opposed to this, and we just tend to kind of dismiss these things?
Well, I think it has to do with the emphasis on science, that if you can't prove it, if you can't see it, touch it, prove it, it
Mm.
doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is people are afraid. They're afraid of these experiences.
Yeah.
What does that mean? You know, is there something wrong with me? Or, you know, it's really hard for them to accept.
Mm. Mm.
And I think that
Yeah.
has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. Which I've thought about that a lot, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that it's it's quite ridiculous that we tend to believe something that is outside of ourselves. So, for example, scientific proof of something rather than our own personal experiences.
That's right.
I find that really, it's ridiculous when you think about it. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, so I'd rather believe a scientist, someone in a white coat, or, you know, doing
Yeah.
this sort of research, than my own vision of my mom or whoever passed
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
yeah, wow.
And there's something else when you're talking about white coat, it reminded me of, um, I was talking to a group of psychiatry residents, and they were talking about how a lot of the regular physicians and surgeons, if somebody is experiencing one of these, deathbed visions or whatever,
Yeah.
or talking or terminal lucidity, they'll just medicate them
Oh,
rather than talk about what's happening and share in that. But the
wow.
quickest thing for them to do is medicate them. So, but
God.
these residents won't do that. Now
Right.
we talked about that because that's
Wow.
such an important thing for the person who's dying, you
Yeah.
know, to be able to talk about what's happening to them instead of being shut off somewhere or medicated.
Yeah, definitely. Oh God. Oh, that just hurts just thinking about it.
I know, it does,
Yeah.
it does.
It's like, let's numb you even more.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh wow. But yeah, no, but yeah, it's definitely improving, I think. And obviously you've noticed as well that more people are becoming open to it, which is really amazing to see. And again, for me personally, one of the um just most negative things that I found is how much of an impact it's having on people who are dying. And, you know, and just this idea that there is no afterlife, that you just cease to exist, you know, you just disappear like that. I mean, that is probably the worst that anyone can think of, you know, that your life is just going to end and that's it. So yeah, it definitely helps to have
Yeah.
a
But again, you
knowing.
know, so many things are changing. Death cafes are around and they're well attended. We did one that we didn't think we'd get more than, you know, maybe 3 people, and we had a full room.
Wow.
So people want to talk about it, but they want to be safe in talking about it because there are
Mm,
other people who just would, you know,
yeah.
make fun of them or
Mm.
call them weird or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so important. Yeah. So would you
Yeah.
recommend for anyone who is sort of going through grief to first, you know, connect with someone who is kind of part of a group like this, or who knows about this stuff?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Um, I don't know what you have over there. Over here, we have something called Compassionate Friends. Do you have that
Mm.
there? It's for uh, parents who've lost children. There's also helping families heal or helping parents heal.
Mm.
And that's a group that is much more into having psychics and mediums involved in helping the
Yeah.
people who are mourning.
Mm.
And I think that could be very helpful, but not everybody's ready for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
can't,
We have to
you know.
take it slowly. Yeah.
But there's so many, books out there that people could read. But I think it's basically finding somebody that you feel safe talking to
Yeah. Yeah.
is
Definitely.
important.
Wow, that's definitely really important. And yeah, I think altogether, just the work that you've been doing is so important. And I think it definitely, more people should get to know about this sort of research and work altogether, because it's so helpful for everyone, whether you have a relative who's died or you don't, or you're just dealing with any sort of grief. Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
important.
And we can experience grief about anything,
Yeah.
but this is perhaps the most intense grief was when you lose a loved one.
Yes, definitely. But yeah, also, yeah, I remember when my cat died. Actually, I have a really interesting story about that. So my cat, I was really, I was typical pet lover. So yeah,
I'm a pet lover too, so I
yeah,
understand.
I love cats. I mean, I love dogs as well, but cats were just my favorite. But yeah, so I had my cat, and every morning it used to come into my room and sort of walk onto my bed and climb onto the windowsill, and it would just look out into the garden, and it would just stay there for like an hour or so. So when he died, exactly the day after he died, I remember I was in this in-between state of, sleeping and kind of conscious. And I very specifically remember feeling his paws on my bed, and then climb onto the sill of the window, and just, I could just feel his presence. But I very specifically remember being able to feel the pressure of his paws on the bed. And I was just like, wow, this is so amazing, because I could physically feel it. And I remember thinking to myself, this is real, this is real, this is real, I can feel it, so that I don't forget and like just dismiss it after that. But,
and those states, falling asleep or as we begin to wake up, we're more receptive. Our brain hasn't really kicked in yet, so that we're more receptive to these types of things.
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
Great. That's a great story.
I find that too. So I guess if anyone wants to contact their loved one, that's probably the best day to do it at the best time. Yeah. Oh, wow. Marilyn, thank you so much for your time. I really, really cannot thank you enough. It's been so wonderful to speak to you.
I so enjoyed it. I'm sorry our time's up.
Yeah, I know already. It's gone so quickly. But I wanted to ask, do you offer online sessions for people?
No, I don't.
You only, okay, so you only do them in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Okay. How can people find your work if they wanted to know more about you and your articles that you write?
They can do several things. One, they can go to Psychology Today, and my blog is Understanding Grief. And I've got over 40-something articles on there about different things. And you can go to my website, which is MarilynMendoza.com.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll put those links in the description on the videos as well, so people can just check those out. But yes,
it's been a pleasure working with you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Me
Time
too.
went fast.
Me too. Yeah, very fast. I know, it's crazy how 1 hour can just swap by. But are there any last words you want to say, to share, or do you feel
keep an open mind?
Yeah, keep an
open mind. There's more to life than what you see.
Totally. I completely agree. Well, great. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Thank you.
You too.